Good morning, and welcome to the First Existentialist Congregation of Atlanta. We are a philosophically based spiritual community founded on existential philosophy and feminist principles and dedicated to human liberation and the protection of the natural world. My name is Patton White, and I will be facilitating this morning's celebration of life. We make our spiritual home in the old stone church, which was hand-built 100 years ago by the African-American Antioch East Baptist Church. We honor their labors of love and the powerful history of this special place. We acknowledge that our spiritual home stands on land forcibly taken from the Muskogee Creek people. We support justice and equality for all Indigenous people. Our opening words this morning are a poem that I selected from this book called Teasing the Grace, Poems and Stories by Sharon Sanders. Sharon was one of our longtime members here at the First E. This poem is entitled Friends. We pour ourselves into each other like water poured from one cup to another, streaming a bridge of flashing water across the space. As I empty out, I fill you full. You return into my emptiness. The bridge is charged with newly made energy as we empty that which is full and fill that which is empty. Again, that's a poem by Sharon Sanders called Friends. This morning, we have a new musical selection for you. This is a new song. It's an original composition by Gene Heinrich that we just recently recorded in our sanctuary. And it is sung by Carol Harder, Gene Heinrich, Mary Howard, Robert Stewart, and myself, Patton White, with additional music accompaniment by Andy Weiskopf and Craig Rayfuse. And the title, I'm not sure it really has a title yet, but I'm calling it, and I think Gene's calling this song, Pray for Our Sisters. Please rise in body or spirit as you are willing and able to join in singing along or humming along, or just enjoying this beautiful new piece. Thank you so much, Jean, for creating this new, beautiful, artistic response to some of the ugliness that is taking place in our world today. This morning's speaker is the Reverend Marti Keller. Marti Keller self-identifies as a Jewnitarian, a lifelong Jewish UU with abiding curiosity about Jewish thought, values, and culture. She is the co-editor of Jewish Voices in Unitarian Universalism, which is published by Skinner House Books, working on a follow-up book of essays. She is former president of UUs for Jewish Awareness, currently on its board, and was on the executive committee of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Marti Keller.
Good morning. It's really good to be with you at First Existentialists during this period of time in the Jewish source of the Unitarian Universalist faith tradition, Judaism, of the High Holy Days between New Year's, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. I'm going to begin with a poem by Rabbi Rachel Barnblatt. The new year starts as days are waning. I am never ready when the first leaves turn. Every Jewish day begins with evening, darkness before light, since the beginning. Darkness before light. I am never ready for the new year, the Jewish New Year's, and this year is really, really early, here in early September. Having come to its celebration, its requirements for a hard period of introspection, for making amends to those people you have hurt, have offended, turning from fault, another word for sin, to good, teshuvah. Coming late into all of this as the child of secular Jews, completely unobservant secular Jews, I've always felt a step behind. And I just want to say to you that it's all about learning. It's all about gathering more and more information. I knew so little as a young adult, and I'm still learning about this very rich tradition. Last year, I learned about the period of Elul, the month before the beginning of Rosh Hashanah. I had always thought that the days of atonement, the high holy days, were kind of like a very concentrated period of time where you did all that work I just talked about, the taking note of what you had done during the year, making amends, promising to do other things in the year to come. But actually, there's a whole month dedicated to it in fully observant Judaism, a full month of preparations for the confessions and then the resolutions for a new year. This year, oh, by the way, I learned last year about a lot of this because we were all home, so I had a lot more time to look around the internet for services, for classes, for lectures, for podcasts that would help give me more information about this tradition. And this year, in much the same way, I discovered a Jewish commandment, a Jewish event, which is an imperative and significant in Hebrew scriptures as any other holy time. Any of the other major holidays, any of the major observances in Judaism, this one I'm going to talk about today called Shmita, a Shmita year, is just as important, just as relevant, I think, today, just as challenging and just as interesting. So we have begun 5782, if you can imagine. 5782 is when the Jewish calendar began Rosh Hashanah. This Jewish New Year's is also the start of a Shmita year, a sabbatical year, and it happens every 7 years. As secular synagogue Rabbi Denise Handlarsky described Shmita, the literal meaning of Shmita in Hebrew is release. In the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, there are instructions to let the land go fallow for an entire year, to let it rest for an entire year and replenish its nutrients and fertility. It was really just very good land rotation, agricultural product preservation. And so it was actually a really pretty enlightened way of making sure that the land would be there to serve generations of people living in a kind of a desertous climate. It also is a requirement during the Shmita year to release debts and to focus on efforts to help those in need, to share all your private land holdings and make the perennial harvest, those things that are growing all the time, available to all. In other words, to live for a full year, for a full 12 months beginning this week, a more economically equitable life, a more agriculturally sustainable life, a more personally balanced life. Shmita. Shmita is described by another rabbi as a time for letting go of things, letting go of things, letting go of things. An entire year of what we might think of as a Sabbath, but really a sabbatical, and not the kind of sabbatical that maybe some of you had as professors or other folks, or me as a minister, where we were given time out, never a full year, but we were required to provide a plan for how this time away from our ordinary work would actually benefit our workplace, our work, and not this sense that we are going to be released into a period of time where we're actually focusing on this notion of human rest, of psychic rest, and also that all of this rest leads towards equity and justice. Nigel Savage, who is a Jewish ecological activist, looks at a Shmita year as a trial vision for a just society. I love that notion. So this year that we spend, this coming year, every 7 years, the last one was 2014, we are giving ourselves a chance to experience a trial vision for what would be considered a just society. No less than a revolutionary notion, no less than a revolutionary year, personally and collectively, literally and figuratively. So the Shmita does start in the Bible. It has biblical foundation. So I'm going to throw some scripture out at you as an example of the fact that it's very deeply embedded in the Hebrew Bible and what's become the Christian Bible as well. From Exodus. For 6 years to sow your land and gather its produce. But in the 7th year you are to let it rest and go fallow. And the needy of your people may eat, and what you leave the wild animal may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and also with your orchard. And then Deuteronomy, every 7 years you shall grant a remission of debt. A remission of debt. You actually forgive all debt. The Bible says, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbors in your land. Do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your needy neighbor. This is language from the Hebrew Bible. Don't be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards those that are in need, and don't hoard up things and not give people debt, not allow them to borrow from you if you know that in the next year you're going to have to give of your land and forgive the debt. You should rather open your hand willingly enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Also, in the instructions in Deuteronomy and other places about the Shmita year, there are instructions to release slaves, because there were slaves all over the place, just as there have continued to be patterns of enslavement throughout our history. You should release the slaves you have every 7 years. And not only that, provide liberally of your flock, your threshing floor, and your wine presses, thus, quote, giving to them some of the bounty which the Lord your God has blessed you with, remembering you were once a slave in the land of Egypt. Well, despite these very specific instructions, and despite very violent and chilling threats in the Bible for not observing these commandments, for example, there's one part that says, if you're not willing to let the land go fallow, then I'm not going to allow you to be in the land of Israel. Let the land go fallow without you, and you'll just stay outside looking in because you did not do what I told you to do. Despite all of this, Shmita was possibly never actually observed in early biblical times. In other words, we know that there were examples and provisions that poor people were exempted because they needed the money earned from their crops to pay their taxes. There were always taxes. They weren't exempt from taxes, so poor people were exempted like they are often exempted in this country, and certainly in my city, from some of the financial obligation. Perhaps it was more observed during the time of the Second Temple, during like around the time of Jesus, never fully, and it's really not clear how. Sometime over the past months, when I was becoming educated on this previously to me unknown Shmita year, and I have to tell you, to many of the Jewish people I know, I happened to see a social media post from old friends, actually former members of my very first congregation in Dahlonega, who told people on in a social media post, actually on Facebook, that they were done having a vegetable garden year after year. They told me over the phone when I called them back and asked about why they had been moved to make this decision and to post this information, that it was really just becoming too much work to have their large vegetable garden. It wasn't producing well, what with years of drought in Georgia and years of overwetting. Myrna, the wife, had grown up around a family farm, which in the Depression and beyond had fed the family, and provided cash from the cotton and corn and wheat and cattle, pigs, other things that they raised there. Herb, the husband, had grown up in Atlanta. So for him and for her during their marriage, it had been a way of supplementing and giving delicious and healthy supplements to their diet, especially in the summer. And also it was a recreation and activity they shared together. But no matter what, now the plot of land is tired, they told me, and they are tired of tending it. So I began to think of their experience of letting go of a long pastime and the vegetable, the produce that came out of this pastime, and the notion of Shmita. Was their decision to quit tilling and planting on the cusp of a Shmita year a coincidence? Or was it a metaphor or an example for me of taking a sabbatical from gardening? Or I asked them, are you truly finished? They said they were truly finished. If so, if they were done and not just for 1 year with this, what new metaphorical crops or actual practice crops and which harvests, metaphorical or actual harvests, activities in their lives await them in the rest of their lives, to begin to look at Shmita more metaphorically and more creatively. So what is a Shmita year? So it's declared in the Bible in a lot of specificity, and then Talmud and Torah scholars over the centuries, huddled in their study rooms and in their synagogues and argued about it. And here's some of the conclusions that were drawn about what it really means to observe a Shmita year, and it's pretty astounding and pretty radical. Absolutely no reaping vegetables from fields and selling them during a Shmita year. It is okay to harvest that which grows from seeds that fell to earth before the sabbatical year. Fresh and ripe produce, yes. Unripe, not okay. Roots, okay. Here again, very specific. No sales of plows or yokes or winnowing forks or any of the things that you use to work a farm, work land during a regular year. It was okay to eat what we might consider a seasonal diet, things that are planted annually, that which is also eaten by wildlife, fruit from trees you can pick, fruit from vines, figs and grapes and olives and pomegranates. All harvested food from the previous year, fresh or dried or preserved, had to be shared, must be shared with everyone, with the public. No digging, no plowing, no removing, no fertilizing, no grafting, but you can irrigate your land so that the trees and other plants don't die, because in Judaism there's always a primacy of life, so keeping those things alive during a Shmita year. The economic system that supported this imperative to release debts and to share equitably included specifically nullifying all previous debts. The debts that were before and were in place before Shmita year were to be wiped out. If you incurred a debt, if you lent money during a sabbatical year or Shmita year, those debts had to be paid by the end of the year. But any debt payment someone chose to make during the year would be regarded as gifts. And if they weren't considered gifts and given as gifts, they weren't otherwise accepted. Because the Bible only referred to all of these requirements and injunctions and specifications for the land of Israel, for the almost 2,000 years when few Jews lived in Israel, there wasn't a major focus. In fact, I would tell you not a focus at all on observing Shmita. But as Jews began returning there in greater numbers in the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, the challenge of, even the need for what has been called one of the most interesting religious commandments in Judaism soon arose. There were fierce debates among Jewish settlers about this notion of the sanctity of fruits and vegetables and letting the land rest and forgiving debt. Whether or not to reinstate, if there ever actually have been established these requirements actually on the ground, would have been, which were basically sustainability survival instructions to an agricultural tribal people living on a very small and desertous land thousands of years previously, for a people who have been long used to other methods of farming, what little farming Jewish people did, and other economic systems around what they produced and how they earned their living. There were arguments basically about practicality. How could one realistically live on only what fell to the ground during a whole year? So there began to be compromises and just ways of looking at what those requirements were and trying to figure out ways to observe Shmita, but to also stay alive. So one of the practices that began very early on in the late 19th century was selling land to be harvested by non-Jews during the Shmita year. Other solutions were and are buying produce and other things to eat from other countries, in Europe, for example. They've also, in the past few years, purchased produce raised by Palestinian farmers in the Gaza Strip. Or this year, there were extensive negotiations with Jordan on how to import Jordan's fruits and vegetables into Israel over the next 12 months. Very fraught, not a lot of other conversation, but just this very specific negotiation around the sale of produce. And besides this concentration on importing things, could Israeli farmers and Orthodox Jews in other places augment their fruits and vegetable supplies with vegetables that are not grown on the ground, in the earth, raised in pots, in raised beds off the ground, or hydroponically? Certainly during this pandemic in the last year or so, I have seen a lot of this kind of container farming. I don't know if you have, in Atlanta. And then out of that, either a resounding lack of success because of the chipmunks and the bugs, or please to come take the zucchini and lettuce that have survived the chipmunks and the bugs and the snails. Mine almost never have. So that's the literal way the Shmita has taken place over time, either not really taking place or taking place with a lot of sort of creative compromise. But there's ways that there have been efforts to reimagine Shmita over the year. Progressive Jewish groups and congregations have begun to recapture and reimagine Shmita, not just as a set of astonishingly specific land and debt management commandments, but metaphorically, as I said, and creatively. What doesn't matter? What doesn't mean? What is the power in an extended time to slow down, to release and rebalance now? How might it be different for us this year and the next 7 years? So there have been questions people have asked about, for example, and you might want to ask yourself this question or do it during the chat afterwards, the coffee time. How have you given freely of your time and resources since the last Shmita year in 2014, or if you can even remember specifically in 2014, how can you see yourself giving more freely in the next 7 years to yourself in rest and renewal, to the world in sustainability and economic equity? The Shmita project, which started shortly before the last Shmita year in 2014, during that run-up, began to look at how Shmita could look for the majority of Jews and allies in the world that don't live in Israel, who are not Orthodox, who live in the diaspora outside Israel. They point to the notion that we can see Shmita as a way of reminding us that the land is not ours. The land ultimately is not ours. Whether they believe it is God's or not, it is not ultimately ours. That Shmita can metaphorically construct, I love this, a temple in time when all people eat, when all are equal, when all are share, what mine is yours, all of us have time to access, rest and study, peace and quiet, a collective breathing space. Hazan, which means vision in Hebrew, a Jewish justice group, reminds us that Shmita, like virtually all other major Jewish holidays, and in this case years, was never meant to be observed only as a personal time of introspection, of looking inward. It's Judaism, it's the world facing outward. Jews United for Justice sees this year as a critical time to work towards the common good, to replenish the fertility of the land, and to equalize economic inequalities. What if we use the Shmita year and beyond as communities, whether Jewish or not, to redouble our effort to set aside resources, food and other resources, to support all people during all fallow times? What if we set this period of time aside to slow down, not just in the personal sense, but to foster universal care, compassion, and partnership? Words from the Shmita Project. May this be a year of social involvement, spiritual and ethical renewal, and environmental reflection, a gateway in time, an experiment, a vision every 7 years to review the covenant between humans and each other, humans and the earth. What a revolutionary notion. What a possibly revolutionary year.
Thank you so much, Marty, for bringing your words to us this morning. We will be congregating on Zoom immediately following this broadcast, where we will participate in a discussion about the topics that Marty presented today, as well as sharing personal joys, sorrows, and concerns, as well as community announcements. You can find the link to the Zoom meeting in the chat section of today's broadcast. Next week at 11 a.m. we will be welcoming back Franklin Abbott and with his talk, You Are Always in the Middle of Your Life. So we hope to see you either on Zoom immediately following this broadcast or next Sunday at 11 a.m. Until then, have a great rest of your day, have a great week, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.